Dear learners and listeners, Namaskar. I am Dr. Shweta and I am back with my discussion on learning process and acquiring skills part 2. In the previous program, we had already talked about the nature of learning and the basic learning experiment. In today's program, we will be talking about the different ways of learning and also we will be explaining certain important phenomena such as preparedness for learning, learning disability related to learning. Let's begin with different forms of learning. Number 1, skill learning. Skill learning takes place in 3 stages. For example, while learning to ride a bicycle, the individual learns what is required in the task and certain specific components of the task. This is the cognitive stage. In the second stage called association stage, the skill is perfected with accuracy and precision. Finally, the individual need not even think about the various aspects of the task to be performed. The skill becomes automatic. Everyday life is full of activities that demand skills learning such as motor learning, eating with spoon, talking, handwriting, typewriting, driving a car, playing a musical instrument, etc. In all these, practice is required to make responses with speed and accuracy. Motor skills require coordination between environmental and internal bodily stimuli and the act to be performed. The second type of learning is known as verbal learning. The child begins to acquire verbal skills as the child grows. Initially, a child has limited understanding of what certain words and gestures mean. Verbal learning involves learning to respond to words or with words. As the child grows up, the child develops improved verbal skills such as naming objects, pronouncing words, combining words to form sentences, writing sentences to convey an idea, and so on. The child acquires a new vocabulary to communicate properly. Verbal skills are generally acquired through memorizing by repeating, recalling, and recognizing the material. Speaking is a complex skill involving both motor as well as symbolic or verbal skills. It is acquired partially on the basis of reflex vocalization which appears during infancy and also through imitation and modeling. While studying verbal learning, psychologists use a number of methods for presenting the material. They include serial learning, free recall and paired associates learning. In serial learning, the learner is asked to recall in the way the words were presented to him or her. Free recall requires the learner to recall the words without regard to their order of presentation. In the paired associates, the verbal material is presented in pairs such as CRAT book, C-R-A-T, CRAT dash book, that is the word is presented in the form of pairs. Another form of learning is known as concept learning. Concept is a category name and it has certain characteristics. Concept learning involves both generalization and differentiation. An individual learns to distinguish between two or more stimuli which differ in some detail. For example, the child learns what is an animal. Later, the child differentiates between dog and a cat, etc. Thus, an individual learns to make different responses to stimuli from different categories. All concepts represent a set of features connected with the help of some rule. The individual learns to respond to object in his or her environment in terms of their different features like color, shapes, position, number and so on. He or she tries to find certain common properties in a group of objects and attaches some category names to them. Various words which are normally used to denote an object such as house, car, school, animal, dog and so on are examples of concepts. Learning concepts is useful in understanding the world and in solving problems. Most of the subjects which we study involve concept learning. Another type of learning is social learning. As we grow, our environment widens to include people, objects and events. We learn new habits as well as modify our perception of objects, events, persons and attitudes. Much of the learning of an individual involves change in one's attitudes. An attitude is a learnt way to act towards an object, person, situation or an idea. It determines favorable or unfavorable responses to the person, situations, places or things. For example, one learns to respect and disrespect different persons in his or her environment due to habit formation and attitudes. Certain social responses are reinforced by the society if they are acceptable as per the norms of the society. The learned behavior of a person is shaped accordingly. In addition to other mechanisms, social learning involves imitation of the role models, which is a process by which individuals learn new behavior by observing others, also called modeling or observational learning. In this process, no direct reinforcement is involved. Let's talk about a very important concept in learning, which is learning curve. Learning can be measured by assessing the performance of an individual on a given task. The rate of learning, as normally measured by performance, can be represented graphically by placing the units of practice on the x-axis and degree of learning on the y-axis. The horizontal axis of the graph represents the amount or units of practice. The vertical axis shows the degree of learning on some measure of performance such as time to achieve a goal, etc. In this diagram, curve A shows very little or no improvement initially, followed by a period of rapid improvement, after which there is a period of least improvement or no improvement, indicating a plateau or flatness. The rate of learning varies from person to person and time to time for any given individual for any given task. For example, in learning to typewrite, in the beginning, one student may show rapid improvement while another may need to practice for a long time before his or her performance improves. Sometimes, a person may reach a certain level of performance in typewriting and may remain at that level for few days, after which the person may show improvement. Learning curves can be prepared for any learning task. So, these were some concepts involving learning. We should also know that what are the various factors that influence learning. These factors are related to the stimulus, task or the learner. Number 1, reinforcement learning requires motivation, and reinforcement is an important aspect of motivation. A reinforcement is anything that strengthens a response and increases the probability of its occurrence. A reward is an example of reinforcement. Reinforcement is the key to learning. If it is not applied in the right way at the right time, there will be no observable learning. Reinforcement is of two types, primary and secondary. The source of reinforcement is called reinforcer. A primary reinforcer is a natural or unlearned source of reinforcement. Food is a primary positive reinforcer for a hungry animal. A secondary reinforcer, on the other hand, is learnt or an acquired source of reinforcement. The rule for learning a secondary reinforcer is that it should be paired with a primary reinforcer. The effect of reinforcement depends on the way it is given. Number 2 is feedback or knowledge of the result. It is another motivational variable. If you are provided with knowledge of results or feedback, the efficiency of your learning is increased. For example, while learning to type, knowledge of one's performance on each trial will help to know where the person has made mistakes. The person may try to correct accordingly. It also helps to eliminate errors and increase the precision in performance. Knowledge of results, especially when favorable, reinforces learning and maintains interest and motivation. Next is distribution of practice. That is one of the factors that influences your learning. The length of practice session and distribution of rest periods between trials affect the progress of learning to a great extent. It has been found for a wide variety of motor skills that practice is more effective when it includes brief and judiciously distributed rest pauses. This leads to rapid learning as compared to continuous practice. However, practice periods should not be too long. The acquisition of skill in playing badminton may improve more after 3 1-hour long practice sessions with intervals rather than after one continuous 3-hour long session. That means distribution of practice. The practice periods should also not be too small and frequent either. This would tend to break the task into small and meaningless parts. Next is whole and part learning. If you have learnt the entire lesson in totality, it would have been difficult for you to learn, as it is easier to learn it in parts than as a whole. You might have tried that if you try to grasp 4 pages material in one go, it becomes difficult for you. But if you break the practice sessions and if you break it in parts and do it page wise, then it becomes easy for you to learn. Whole learning is often considered as an efficient method to learn the task, particularly for fast learners and for short or meaningful material which is easily memorized as a whole. But if the content is very long, it may first be learnt in parts and then as a whole. Another is meaningfulness. How meaningfulness affects your learning. Try to learn words like cat, dog, bat, doll, which have meaning, and nag, bab, call, pem, which are nonsense syllables having no meaning. Meaningfulness of the material to be learnt contributes to your learning efficiency. If the material to be learnt is meaningful, the rate of learning becomes rapid. The more meaningful the material, the fewer the trials or practice sessions are required to learn it. Another important factor is the interest and attitudes of the learner. One of the important determinants of effective learning is the learner's attitude towards the material to be learnt. For example, if you are interested in learning to learn and recognize that it will help you in achievement of your goals, you develop a favorable attitude towards any topic of interest and you will make sincere effort to learn and remember it. If one feels that nothing worthwhile will result from learning something, one's rate or progress of learning will be poor. Let us discuss the phenomena related to learning. Learning is one of the most widely investigated fields of study. As a result, the researchers have observed a variety of the phenomena which are peculiar to the process of learning. We have already discussed about some of them in connection with conditioning and factors influencing learning. Here, we are going to know about 3 more phenomena which are of great importance. They include preparedness for learning, learning disability, and transfer of learning. Let's know about preparedness for learning. You must have noticed that various organisms and animals, example man, rat, cat, dog, differ in their sensory and motor capabilities. Thus, dogs have extra sensitive nose. Similarly, cats jump and run very fast. A close scrutiny of the variations found across species indicates that organisms work under certain biological limits or constraints. Every organism is not equally ready or prepared to learn a given response. Organisms are differentially endowed with capability to respond. So, the possibility and ease of learning is determined by the degree of preparedness on the part of the organism for a given learning task. All organisms are not equally prepared for all responses or associations. This becomes one of the key determinants of learning. Now let's talk about learning disability. It is a disorder which leads to difficulties in reading, writing, speaking, and doing mathematical exercises. These problems are found because of some problems in the central nervous system. It may be related to the sensory impairment or some kind of mental or physical handicap. They may occur in children with average or superior intelligence. If not remedied, they may continue and interfere with their personal and social development in subsequent years. The main features of children with learning disability include difficulty in writing and reading, attentional problems, poor motor coordination, perceptual disorders, and difficulty in following instructions. An important problem faced by them is dyslexia, in which children fail to distinguish letters. For example, they may find difficulty in distinguishing P and I, was and saw. Remedial teaching is used in helping these children. Let's come up to the very important aspect of learning, which is known as transfer of learning. Transfer of learning is the process of applying or carrying over the knowledge, skills, habits, attitudes, or other responses from one learning situation in which they were initially acquired to a different learning situation. For example, a person who has learned to ride a bicycle finds it easy to learn to ride a scooter. It means that experience or performance on one task influences performance on subsequent learning tasks. A person's ability to recognize objects, perceive relationships, and conceptualize the experiences of daily life are facilitated by transfer of learning. The influence of transfer is found not only in the domain of intellectual tasks and in complex motor skills, but also in emotional reactions and attitudes of individuals. If transfer of learning does not take place, each task would have to be learnt afresh and it would make life difficult. There are different types of transfers of learning. Transfer of training affects learning of a new task in 3 ways. It can be a positive transfer, it can be a negative transfer or a zero transfer. Positive transfer means when learning of the task makes the second task easier to learn. Positive transfer effect is seen. What one has learned in one subject or a task may facilitate learning in another subject or task. In positive transfer, the carryover of the knowledge or skill is beneficial to future learning. For example, after learning to spell the word house, a child may be able to apply the appropriate phonetic rule and spell the word mouse correctly even without being taught the word mouse. Similarly, skill in riding a bicycle facilitates learning to ride a motorcycle. Learning the rules of addition and subtraction makes it easier to count one's change and check the balance when one makes purchases from the market. Learning to drive a car makes it easier to learn to drive a truck or a bus. In all these cases, the previous learning experience facilitates subsequent learning. Positive transfer occurs when the responses expected from two tasks or learning situations are similar. However, the maximum amount of positive transfer is obtained when the stimulus and the response elements in the previous and the new learning situations are similar. For example, learning of a stimulus response relationship like that of 5 multiplied by 8 is equals to 40 and 8 multiplied by 5 is equals to 40. In this case, there is similarity between the elements in the stimulus response relationship. Second is negative transfer. There are cases in which the previous learning interferes with the subsequent learning. In such cases, the carryover of the knowledge or experience in one task interfere with further learning. As a result of negative transfer, performance on one task may block performance on the subsequent task. For example, a child's experience in learning the plural of house may inhibit his or her learning the plural of a word mouse. He or she may spell the plural of the word mouse as mouses instead of mice. Negative transfer usually occurs when the stimuli in previously learnt task and the new task are the same or comparable, but the responses are dissimilar. The another is the zero transfer. There are instances where the learning of one task does not have any effect on the ability of a person to perform another task. It happens when the tasks are dissimilar in stimuli as well as responses. In zero transfer, the performance in the new situation is neither aided nor hindered by the past learning. Learning history may contribute to the understanding of one's own culture, but it has hardly any effect on learning mathematics. Similarly, improving one's skill in playing football will have no effect on the improvement of one's skill in writing an essay. Learning to typewrite will not affect the learning of painting. So, dear learners, this was all for today's program, where we have talked about the different types of learning and the various factors that influence learning. Before we sum up, let's understand that what we have discussed in part 1 and 2 of learning and acquiring skills. Let's sum up. Learning can be described as the process by which any relatively permanent change in behavior occurs as a result of practice or experience. It is a continuous and a gradual process that brings about improvement in performance. Learning differs from other concepts such as maturation, reflex actions and instinctive behavior. Learning is a result of experience whereas maturation is biological in nature. Maturation provides the readiness to learn and occurs due to neural and muscular development, while learning takes place through practice and experience. Learning and maturation both result in modification of behavior. Certain complex patterns of behavior which occur innately are called instinct. Reflex is a direct and immediate response of a muscle or gland to the stimulation of a sense organ. Conditioning is a form of associative learning. In classical conditioning, a neural conditioning stimulus, that is CS, is paired with the unconditioned stimulus, that is US, that evokes an unconditioned response, that is UR. After repeated pairing of the two stimuli, the conditioned stimulus will elicit a response similar to the unconditioned response. This elicited response is called the conditioned response. Generalization, differentiation, extension and spontaneous recovery are some of the concepts related to conditioning. In operant conditioning, the response is instrumental in getting reward or escaping punishment. Skill learning requires a coordination between environmental and internal bodily stimuli to produce a muscular response involving movement. It occurs in three stages, which is cognition, association and automation. Verbal learning involves understanding of words such that a child can pronounce words, combine them to form sentences and convey ideas through words. Concept learning develops the abilities in an individual to classify objects in terms of their characteristics or common properties. Social learning involves the learning of new attitudes, social norms and to be able to live and behave according to the socially acceptable patterns of society through modeling. Transfer of learning is the process of applying or carrying over the knowledge, skill, habit, attitudes or other responses from one learning situation in which they were initially acquired to another learning situation. In positive transfer, learning in one situation facilitates or bring about improvement in another learning situation. In negative transfer, learning in one situation hinders the learning in another situation. In zero transfer, the learning in one situation does not affect the learning in another situation due to no relationship between the stimuli and responses of the two situations. The factors affecting learning include reward and punishment, feedback or knowledge of results, distribution of practice, division of learning task, meaningfulness, interest and attitude and motivation. So, this was all for today's program. I hope you have understood all the concepts well about learning. Thank you.